absorbing damage.
Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG. Welcome to our show. There's a great question out there, and it's on the lips of just about every other person that is an influencer that I know, and that is Dungeons and Dragons in its death throes? Is this the end of role playing as a whole, and are we seeing a weather change? I do believe we are, and we will get right into it. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG. All right. So, the question that's on everybody's lips, as I said, is Dungeons and Dragons in trouble? There have been a lot of news stories in just the past couple of weeks that have made it seem that there's maybe some problems with the castle, so to speak. And as a person who has been playing for 50 years, I've seen other dramas play out throughout that time. And while there are issues with the newest edition, and there are certainly those that are champions of it and those that are opposed to it, the reality of it is that the storytelling mechanism that is Dungeons and Dragons had problems to start with. We're going to be talking tonight about a few of them, and I'm going to be offering an alternative. And most of you have been watching long enough that you may already know what I'm talking about, but we will see. So let's go. Okay, if we're going to say that Dungeons and Dragons is over, and I'm not specifically saying that, but let's look at a basic autopsy of what has died. What is it? Where is it that the producer of Dungeons and Dragons and the players of Dungeons and Dragons have parted company? There's been a drastic change in the game mechanic with the newest 2024 edition, and whether it's a rewrite of 2014 or whether it's merely a new edition of a new way to play, the drama mechanic of it has shifted. And there are problems with the mechanics. So we're going to be going over the autopsy of it. We're looking at it from the long term. And so we have to go in the Wayback Machine, so to speak, back to when role playing began and discuss the particulars that were involved and some facts that will play into it include American warfighting mechanisms of that period, the game legacy of those individuals who started the company, regardless of their personal aspersions. We're going to be looking at it much more analytically, just as you would in the case of a surgical issue. In particular, let's see here. In particular, we're going to be talking about the very structure of the mechanism of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this is going to be somewhat in the weeds, I suppose, and this is a if you're a viewer of my videos, you know that I've got these tangents that I go shooting down sometimes. But in this case, it's something you probably have heard before. The mechanism for just the concept of Dungeons and Dragons has to be almost separated from the lore. And that's actually a good thing. The mechanism for Dungeons and Dragons, the very concept of the elements of play, in particular the characters, is directly tied to the concept from which it sprang. The players of Dungeons and Dragons, the people who launched it, were from what is known as a select segment of gamers, and they're generally lovingly called grognards. And yeah, that does have to do with alcohol. The idea was that they were the guys that would come back after military service or military combat and raise a cup and talk about the past. And that's fundamentally what the source was for Dungeons and Dragons. We were the people who played in that time, and this is actually the guys that were designing it and such. So this is technically before me because they had to build the game before I could start to play it. So although I'm old, I'm not quite that old. But the idea of the role play game stemmed from the war game, and I did a rather extensive breakdown on this some time ago, and I guess I'll be in particular looking that up and linking to it for this so that I don't have to go over all of it. But the concept is that the classes that we know directly stem from the unit types that were used in those earlier war games that from which it sprang. So bear with me a second. So therefore your frontline massive force would be your tanks, your literally, and your archers and light armored fellas would be your scouts, and then your wizards and such would be your artillery, and your clerics would be your support or repair units. And building out the optimal adventuring group was mechanically just that, getting all of your bases covered and picking up all of your units. Now this is way back before the concept that later developed through video game play of the tank and the debuff and the buff, and all of those were those were not even yet in the thought process, but rather the completion of your unit would be to have at least one of each of those, so you were covering all of the angles for that optimal military unit. And then therefore the individual hit point pools for the characters was akin to the support value, or what was called the logistics value for those units. And that was because the warfighting mechanism that had been developed in the 60s was actually a way to perceive of warfare in a way where you could be abstract somewhat, and so therefore you didn't have to go into the particular details of where the unit was hit, how many bullets were missing, how many shovels were missing, and so on. It was a way to handle combat that was simpler to understand. It didn't make perfect sense, but it was the perfect form for the game, and it allowed players therefore to deal with the atrocities of death in a way that was antiseptic, as it were. So when we're talking about the autopsy of Dungeons and Dragons, what we're really talking about is the legacy of this leader was actually built on 1960s warfighting. And if you're not familiar, feel free to leave some comments. I'd be glad to have a great conversation about that in the comments below. But the element, therefore, of play was something that was built in the 1960s, and we'll talk about why that is here in a minute. Now, as we talk about this concept of combat being the equivalent of warfighting technology was developed fundamentally in the development of World War II, because we were trying to figure out how to deal with conflict with a nation from across the sea that wasn't a direct neighbor, and so we had to consider wisely how we could use our assets to greatest effect to accomplish that. And um, the very idea of build and build and build and don't really consider the the cost. You simply were front loading the ability to, pardon me, overtake an opponent by actually making them unable to continue. And so that's where the hit point pool came from. But in addition to that, we had the concept of how you determine success or failure. And again, they were looking at it from the standpoint of a statistical model and would graduate your relative success or failure in order to emulate the very idea of a hero's journey, going from a young, underdeveloped, and fundamentally weak unit and how to advance it so that your ability to complete your action would increase over time. And because they were using that model, the statistical values were easy to emulate on a 20-sided die. The elements of randomness were metered by the advancing skill of your unit. And as those numbers became more obvious, for example, in the case of a 20-sided die, if you have a 10 as a required number, that's exactly half of the numeric value on the die, so therefore 50%. One more past that is 11, and 11 is more than half, so that even at the beginning, your wonderful THAC0, your 2-hit armor class 0 number, that mystical value, would therefore feel natural. The idea of, well, you're new, so about half the time you're going to be successful. And then as you advance over time, 8, 9, 10 levels later, you are now at better than parity. You're almost at absolute success. And then, of course, they included the rule of 1, whereas you ought to fail on a 1 no matter what your die roll is. And that has play into the mathematics of it as well. We've talked earlier, we had an entire video on statistical significance, and I'll try to link that one here too. And the concept, therefore, of the one side out of these 20 being a problem always gives that feeling of significance to the game mechanically, because it will roll fundamentally 1 out of 20 times in general. And therefore, with this mechanism in play, although it wasn't the best, it wasn't the most realistic, and it certainly wasn't the panacea, it was still nonetheless the really best choice among all possible choices for the game mechanic. And that secret that represents is also carried through by something else in die rolling. And I've also mentioned this in another video. We talked about the rule of 8. If you're wanting your players to feel like they're doing well, even in a challenge, if you always determine a way to get their odds to be 8 or better on a 20-sided die, regardless of what the difference is between their attack value and the opponent's defense value, if that's always 8 or better, you're giving your players at least better than a fighting chance of succeeding. And it's kind of like putting your thumb on the scale. You don't actually reveal that necessarily in play. And so I'm letting you see behind the curtain, because the reality is that these triggers, these mechanisms that were built into the Dungeons and Dragons model, made it the more effective tool. And because the Dungeons and Dragons model is built with the success mechanism in there, it didn't need to give a paint job to the reality. And so it was a panacea in one way, and that is that every game, every world builder, every storyteller that played could utilize that same mechanism. And they discovered over time that it could even be used for genres that were not targeted to it. For example, in the early days of the what they call the D20 glut in the 80s, there were game systems that were in the modern realm, in the superheroes realm, and such that eventually developed into their own titles and are with us still today. But they are fundamentally the heir apparent and godchildren, if you will, of Dungeons and Dragons as a model. And those mechanisms are still fundamentally the basis of the majority of role-playing games that are out there. Alrighty, so now the question becomes, we talked a little bit about the classes, that they were established as stand-ins for the earlier military models. But when we talk about character class now, we're actually talking about the lore side of it. And there was one king of the hill in the literary world at the time as well, and that was the Dungeons and Dragons was fundamentally following in the footprints, if you will, of Tolkien as far as a story mechanism. The story as told of Frodo and Sam Gamgee and all those personas was itself a rather ancient story mechanism. There is Pilgrim's Progress and there is Moby Dick, and all of those stories fundamentally follow that concept, that you're following some driving story that actually holds the players to a course from weakness towards strength. And the stories that game masters necessarily had to tell also tended to have to fall into that model. But there was a challenge because the very licenses, very identity of those properties were protected items under copyright law. And so therefore the names of the species had to change. The idea of what you actually called the different classes came up. And then on top of that, you got literally the Terran world, the world in which we live, really playing a pressure game on roleplay, because certainly there were gods aplenty, so to speak, in those in those heady days, and players wanted to see what the mechanism would be like if you introduced those very archetypes into your fantasy setting. And since the world's building mechanism had been showing and demonstrating off of those worlds that were created by the original storytellers, Greyhawk, Blackmore, and so on, those elements had a certain feel and a certain flavor, and the idea of adding other elements from the actual real world were definitely embraced in production. They certainly produced game materials such as Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, and Legends and Lore, and the idea of these product elements gave the opportunity for a player to infuse their own personal beliefs into the game mechanism, which was perfectly acceptable. It was a new way to play. The idea of being able to entreat to the actual point of communicating with these deities, or even railing against them, or raising even weapons against them, was perhaps psychologically unconscionable, but it was kind of a heady, exciting thing to do, to see what it would be like to take on the various named deities. Now, there would today be conversations about cultural appropriation. There'd be conversations about an impropriety of attempting to downplay or humiliate the different cultures that you played against. But you have to realize our world also was in that position. The rate at which we had access to information was in a different place. And it really was exploratory in nature. It was not necessarily adversarial at all. It was simply, okay, I've heard of this certain deity and I would like to challenge them and see how they integrate. Now, in all candor, even back then, there were certain ones that you generally didn't engage with, but they were at least bandied about in the back rooms of game shops across the country because it was, kind of appealing to see what this certain deity or that certain culture, what that would feel like. And especially when you're talking about a bunch of Americanized, Americentric, and fundamentally isolated people, because we, as Americans, are not as collectively culturally astute. It was looked at directly through the lens of we the people, so to speak. And so therefore there were those places where it would be a challenge today to even broach the subject. And perhaps it'll be easier to assimilate. What's really fascinating is that the very idea of utilizing individual cultures to identify species in the world of role play games has become sort of a bellwether. Everybody's really concerned or up in arms over what that really will mean. But the idea is that the cultures that you're going to be emulating, again, taking my teeth out, back in my day, you would just simply address them and you would call the species whatever you called them, but you would give them, for example, vocal inflection of a certain culture or a mode of speech that would emulate someone. And yes, perhaps that was bad and it was a caricature. But the reason for doing that was we were dealing with the other, the stuff that we don't know, and attempting to transfer it to the tabletop so that it can be manipulated and explored in a playful environment, not in any hard and specific way. It wasn't like it was designed to be a referendum on moralism or the understanding of how the different groups interacted. But this nature, therefore, was associated with the culture from which the players evolved. And so the very concepts of what was called a cleric was directly associated with the primary religions of the world and generally focused on the concept of the I'll say it, the Catholic mechanism, the idea of the Benedictine or Dominican priest was really overlaid on it. And because that was problematic or a challenge, it was softened or mitigated somewhat by including other archetypes for the other classes, which itself also tended to strain the believability of the game itself. And so while it did create a fantasy from which these things could be drawn, it was still trying to draw upon the understanding of how those elements worked internally. And so therefore a group would not be all warriors and wouldn't necessarily be all priests or rogues, thieves. They were a mix and a hodgepodge, and that was because the mechanic required it. Whoa. I don't know why that's there. Go to sleep. All right. So now covering the subject of how the games changed really comes down to the focus of the games group. The more, or I should say, the less often they played, the less any of this would matter. The idea of a playing piece on a board in a miniatures game or a tabletop adventure game didn't necessarily have anything to do with the personality of the player. But as the games become more frequent and you're playing the character more often, then the identity of that persona gets kind of tied into the persona of the player and causes them to start this questioning mechanism. Who am I? What am I doing here? When did these things occur? Are they associated with previous adventures we've done? Where are we in this fictional world? And does that have a bearing on what we know and what these individuals we're interacting with are like? Why are we having encounters in particular of this type? And how do we affect the mechanics of it? In other words, when you're talking about how magic works, for example, having a hodgepodge list of all possible magical effects was fine when you're simply playing a persona week over week that's just a playing piece on a game table. But when you start to identify with and recognize yourself as that person, then there needs to be, there's a desire, I should say, for a greater understanding and a deeper dive into the very ethos from which the characters develop. And I think this is where over time there was an actual undermining of the power of, for example, divine magics compared to the arcane magics. They didn't really initially have much difference. Players collected a list of magical effects. They chose which ones they were going to use for the day, when they were going to use it, more like different types of ammunition, if you will, making all of the units fundamentally different warfighting tools again, which fed into the original basis of it. But once you start doing actual role play with those persona, now the feeling of those individuals needs to be identifiable. And again, early in the process they were, because even the very concept of the metaclass monk, for example, was so different from the others that it was its own element. It was something that to aspire to, but it was not something that was easy to play. And so they intentionally made it so that if you're going to draw in these other cultures, you need to reach beyond the knowledge gap. And I think that's really important, because when I started playing, again, pulling my teeth out, back in my day, the very concept of the monk was not as clearly defined as differentiating between the Eastern monk and the Western monk as it became later. Now, in the final estimation, when you come down to modern times, it really is no longer that, but it's simply a way to define the damage dealing mechanism of that style. And it doesn't really translate into a cultural identity. And I think mechanically that was a good thing. And I think that one of the challenges is that as D&D gropes for its identity, its intellectual property, and what really is unique to the Dungeons and Dragons model, really came down to how do you identify those things outside of explaining how the culture actually came to be. And I think that's the problem, is that the process by which we got to where we are now required such a contortion of the reality of the fantasy setting that it formed its own bubble. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is that there's a kind of a reinforcement of the identity politics, and I'm only meaning that in the terms of the game mechanism, that therefore adjusted or chopped and channeled the very concepts that created the power base in its inception. So, for example, the very idea that a priest, a cleric within the game, no longer requires a deity to grant him their powers. Even the warlock doesn't have to have an agreement in its origin phase, but advances to get that, really is showing that there's a differentiation now between power for power's sake and the older models, which were trying to bring a singular understanding and spread it across different players within the group. And I think that's really where the mechanism of Dungeons and Dragons has kind of lost its bearing, lost its anchor, because it's moved so far afield from what it was that now it's going full circle, and we're bringing back the very attempts at cultural appropriation in the meta, so to speak, the idea that a certain Terran racial profile is placed on an adventuring species, or perhaps even a monstrous species, in order to explain its differentiation from the rest of culture, is problematic. And it's ironic that it's putting things fundamentally right back where they were, but they're doing it in a different way, so they're seen as sensitive and concerned and caring, when that really wasn't what it was before. We were simply looking at a set of statistics on a piece of paper that were a certain monstrous type, and therefore adjusting and altering understanding of how the units interact became more dramatic and far less militarily equivocation. So now, this is an old phrase, and when I was in the military, it was a daily reality, and that was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Dungeons and Dragons, for the majority of its existence, really didn't have much bearing on the GMs that were running games in it, because the very model was built so that we could have our own worlds and we could have our own understanding of how things worked. And we were the ones who were creating the story elements that would emulate the different cultures. And therefore, it was not homogenous. It was not defined for us by the mechanism. This changed, of course, as time went by, because the company was actually developing its understanding of how intellectual property works and was fighting to define itself so that it wouldn't be constantly overrun. When we look back at the points where the boundaries boiled over, whether you're talking about the original split from Dungeons and Dragons to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or later the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons to the D20 mechanism, and then from the D20 mechanism to 3rd edition, these stair steps of realization, stair steps of identity building and actually world building were being built in the background, so to speak, because the powers that be, those organizations that were in charge of the licensing of the property, were really struggling to create an enforceable framework. And the big kerfuffles we've had in the recent past concerning the removal of the OGL or the replacement of the OGL or the redefining of the OGL, those all were power grabs specifically intended to bring the property back into alignment, so that those that were playing in that game were actually playing that game instead of somebody else's interpretation of it, and trying to force the adherence of game masters to create property that would fall within the guidelines was actually counterintuitive, because the very idea of world building fundamentally was setting storytellers at odds from one another. And I think it was kind of a portion of our worldview that there should be a conformity of outcome, in other words, that a player should have the same experience at any game master's table, became the real challenge. If we look at, say, franchising in other ways, such as McDonald's or Burger King, or name your favorite fast food place or department store or whatever, they all have a desire for the uniformity of outcomes so that the participants will be getting the same, as the young folk would say, the feels, that the game engine is not itself going to change the way the players experience the mechanism. And that's unfortunately almost impossible to do, because every game master fundamentally carries with him his kernel of belief about what that world engine might feel like or look like. So that when we look at it today, we look back and we say, well, if I've been GMing for X number of years, and in my case 5 decades, the mechanism will only change when my perspective changes. And as the world itself shifted, so went the player base. And one of the challenging and most interesting things is that the number of players that a GM can handle has been fundamentally the same. So it's rare to find somebody who can accommodate 30, 40, 50 players in a game world, let alone in a game session. And so very few would have the perspective that I have, because very few would have a world that is defined in such a way. Instead, they will pick up and run with whatever fictional setting is provided. And yes, there were modules that felt like King Arthur. There were modules that felt like Terran Wanderer, and so on. And this alteration of the worldview by the game masters really wasn't part of the story. There are very few game masters who have fully developed worlds anymore, it seems. And that's because those of us that have been in this if it ain't broke, don't fix it mode, so that there are players who have come to my sessions still carrying their D&D. I don't currently have anybody that's doing this, but during previous iterations, I would have players bring the manuals and the rules books from the other mechanisms, because it was their own way of transacting and interacting with the world, because it was the mechanism that they played with, and therefore their perception of how those numbers would play out would be associated with that mechanism. And so therefore, as a game master, I learned to adapt and adjust to what those players wanted from the game, and tried to provide a uniformity of experience even within just the meta of my own game sessions. Now, herein lies the rub. If you are a game master and you're playing a world that is based upon the Dungeons & Dragons franchises, then you, by definition, have to watch where your bread is buttered. Your very world view is going to be dependent upon the game system that you're playing. And so I see that there are going to be game masters who don't even react to the 2024. There may be brand new players who are drawn into the name of the property by the popularity of it on the meta scale. And of course, the manufacturer is constantly trying to add new to the mechanism, because that's how you drive sales, as you get people to buy the books. And so they will perceive of their, quote, new audience as being the audience they're trying to reach to. But the challenge of the description of and the mechanism of play has changed so radically that the new players coming to the game wouldn't even spend a moment looking at the way I play and seeing that as valuable. I believe this is why you've seen so many of the veteran game masters who have been online propagators moving away from it now. there are certain of them that have said that they've gotten direct word from the machine operator, so to speak, that operates the doorways to the audience, but that's it's a service related mechanism, and so therefore the very way people play is going to be associated with that as well. So that if you are a new player, you're going to be playing the game that is being published right now. And if you are a new storyteller, you're going to be compelled to operate under the mechanisms of the newer version. And I think this is where we're hitting loggerheads. Game masters who've done it as long as I have certainly have perspectives in their world that will not fit the current model in a one-to-one way, simply because, as the saying goes, I don't downshift that fast. I don't switch gears that quickly, and therefore the way in which I present the world is based on what my perception of it has been. And so I'm not going to fit into the model of the new game masters. And I believe there's going to be a raft of new pardon me. There's going to be a raft of new I don't know what that was about. There'll be a raft of new Game Masters and Game Master support properties and Game Master support speakers like myself that are going to come out of the woodwork. Now, I'm not coming from the very concept of a hardline Dungeons and Dragons lore builder. Instead, I've been fundamentally freelance for the entire time. The story elements that I tell play on the mechanics, or did play on the mechanics, of classic Dungeons and Dragons for decades, but it's no longer the case. And I believe that's where we're going to see the really radical change, is that there are going to be new world builders that are going to be utilizing new mechanics and new concepts of how even role play can exist. And in my case, that's exactly what I'm referring to. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that just a moment from now. Alrighty, so now we've talked about the mechanic of role-playing games, and we can talk about the critical design flaws. But the design flaws are really a issue of the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mechanism, being akin to the infrastructure issues that the state of California has had. And this might, again, push me over the edge in terms of what you're listening to. It may be innovative to you. You might hate it, but the idea is that the design flaws that are intrinsic in a role-play game based on Dungeons and Dragons has everything to do with the flawed nature of human conformity. And that is, as a storyteller, individually, as I play role-play games, I'm not necessarily playing it the same way that the next game master down the street, or different personalities that are online now, or those that have been here in the past would be. And so, for example, the greatest game master, that role, that persona was appropriated by somebody, but whether that statement is one of fact or whether it's a matter of perception really is the key to the reason why this entire mechanism has a flaw. When you build a system that is intended for the very drivers of your story to be intentionally oppositional in their creativity, you build in the very chaos that we're experiencing now. Why Dungeons and Dragons is different from the way it was in the 2014 edition, in the 3.5 edition, the 3.0 edition, the 2.0, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The reason why those systems bred so many alternative realities and alternative dimensions to role play really comes down to what it is that the game fundamentally is. And the idea of making it into a identifiable property is certainly the purview of the creators. There's very little that an individual designer like myself can do to alter that. It's simply their choice. But in doing so, they alienate players enough that other mechanical tools such as Nikos RPG or Call of Cthulhu or whatever, they establish themselves as alternatives that the storyteller can utilize to make the world feel like their own. So I said all of that to say this. Nikos RPG is here. The master book is now available at lulu.com, which is my publisher. You can also purchase it at nikosrpg.com. And there are opportunities for you to see this mechanism as it's truly intended to be, which is an alternative mechanism upon which to build your fantasy realm. Check out the free-to-play version at nikosrpg.com. Go to the Play Now section, and you can download the I think it's an 11-page PDF that has everything you need to build monsters, create stories. There's even the community identity sheet as well as the character sheets, so you can build your stories, you build your world, and build your characters with equal aplomb. And so check that out at nikosrpg.com, and we will see you the next time. Now, we do record Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time, generally speaking, as well as on Friday mornings at 10. And we will be attempting to add a live stream watchable channel in the near future, so watch for that. If you want to become part of our community, check out patreon.com/Nikos and join us as a sponsor. When you do that, you gain access to the games that we play online. Right now we have 2, Fridays and Sundays, and more information on that is available through our website. So we will talk to you again soon. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this has been Nikos RPG.